I knew something was off when Brenda from Human Resources knocked on my office door and whispered that I had forgotten to initial the new non-disclosure agreement. I had not forgotten. I never forget anything. That was the primary reason Synapse Systems ran like a freshly oiled turbine instead of a flaming hoverboard strapped to a toddler. Still, I signed the document, handed it back, and went right back to translating legal jargon into code triggers for the $300 million Viridian Group merger. That was the deal the executives kept announcing like a second, coming at every single town hall meeting, though absolutely nobody in the building actually understood how it worked. 12 years. That was how long I had been at Synapse Systems. I did my work quietly without making a scene, and far away from the ping-pong table crowd or the Slack message warriors who wrote lengthy manifestos about corporate culture on our internal wiki database. I was the one who made sure the merger protocols passed the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission investigations. I was the one who built the quiet integration lattice between the creaking legacy system at Viridian Group and our own technical back-end. That back-end had been held together with duct tape and wishful thinking through 5 separate chief technology officers. It was the boring stuff, the critical stuff, the kind of structural foundation they did not even realize they needed until it broke, and I had to crawl into the server logs at 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve to stitch it all back together. That morning, I had 3 monitors glowing, 2 half-drunk cups of cold coffee on my desk, and a bright note that said Ask Legal about Clause 9, circled in angry red ink. Behind me, the office hummed with the usual startup bravado. Project managers were swaggering around, like they had personally invented time. Developers were arguing about whether data structures had emotional depth, and one intern was playing the same 30 seconds of a popular song on a loop until I nearly stapled his wireless earbuds to the desk. In the middle of all that noise, I sat alone in my corner, reviewing the final compliance protocols for the Viridian Group integration. My full name, Evelyn J. Vance, sat right there on the official federal documentation. I was listed as the third-party signatory, the neutral witness, and the clearance liaison. I was the only bridge between the two companies. Nobody else at Synapse Systems had that clearance. Nobody else even wanted it. The training alone required 6 months of bureaucracy, background checks, and a psychological evaluation. It was like getting licensed to whisper into the ears of federal regulators. They gave me the power years ago, and then they completely forgot they did. I did not mind. I preferred being invisible. There is a lot of freedom in the shadows. You get to build quietly while the loud people drown each other in pointless buzzwords. I was not aiming for the spotlight. I just wanted my systems clean, my documentation tight, and my morning coffee uninterrupted. The only people who ever really noticed me were the ones who knew how fragile the entire setup was. I had a few allies, like Clara in our legal department and Eleanor in the Viridian compliance office. There was also my old manager before he retired to run an animal sanctuary. To everyone else in the building, I was just Evelyn in integration. A quiet, middle-aged woman who dressed too formally, drank too much caffeine, and was generally taken for granted. But then Julian Drake arrived as the new chief operating officer, and the temperature in the building dropped to absolute zero. Julian was in his mid-40s, with a sharp jawline, an expensive haircut, and a suit that probably cost more than my car. He had that classic startup cult leader energy. He was the type of guy who thought synergy was a personality trait and referred to spreadsheets as weapons of mass disruption. He smiled too much, spoke too fast, and introduced himself as a corporate fixer. I knew from the first minute that we were all broken utilities in his eyes, waiting to be replaced by cheaper parts. That morning, I logged into the federal clearance system to prepare my final submission. The Viridian deal was scheduled to close in 72 hours. My compliance sign-off was the absolute last step. Everything was aligned after months of grueling work. The back-end protocols, the audit triggers, the cross-border data protection compliances were all ready. Except, I paused. Something felt wrong in my gut. I could not put my finger on it yet, but my experience told me to double-check. I opened my private folder, marked contingency, and reviewed the specific clause I had highlighted months ago just in case. I knew how these executives operated. I did not build systems for them. I built systems in spite of them because I knew that someday they would trip over their own arrogance and try to throw someone like me under the bus to save themselves. And I had no intention of going under without a plan. I spent the next 2 hours documenting every transaction trail, saving independent log archives, and verifying that my personal clearance keys were isolated from the main company servers. If they wanted a clean transition, they would have to play by the rules. If they did not, they would discover exactly how critical the quietest person in the room could be. I adjusted my glasses, took a final sip of my cold coffee, and waited for the corporate hammer to fall. They say when a company wants to push you out quietly, they do it on a Wednesday morning with free bagels in the break room. That was exactly how they played it. The email arrived at 9:13 in the morning. It was a mandatory all-hands meeting set for 10 sharp. The subject line promised executive introductions and organizational updates. In corporate speak, that meant someone new was holding the axe, and heads were about to roll. Julian Drake spoke for 42 minutes straight, tossing out terms like agility, modernization, and legacy tech rot. The people around me clapped like he was leading them to the promised land. I just sipped my bad coffee and worked on my terminal, repairing a broken data bridge that nobody else even knew was failing. 3 hours after the meeting ended, Brenda from Human Resources knocked on my door again. This time, she did not bring any compliance documents. She brought 2 Human Resources representatives with her, one carrying a clipboard and the other staring past me with empty eyes. Brenda asked if we could speak privately. That was the official transition to the firing squad. They led me into a small side room. There was no eye contact, no offer of water, just a thick envelope slid across the wooden table like a ransom note. Julian Drake did not even bother to show up. The termination letter inside was a soup of corporate jargon about redundancy and shifting core competencies. The clipboard representative told me I needed to return my security badge and company laptop before 3 in the afternoon. The other one added that building security had already been notified. I stood up, walked to the door, and froze. Right there on the front reception desk, next to the visitor log and a dying office plant, was a printed color photo of my face. Someone had written in thick red marker across the bottom that security must not let her back on the floor. I was not an employee who had given 12 years of her life. I was just a threat taped to the security desk. It hit me like a physical blow. I had trained their last 3 technical directors. I had kept their operations running on pure willpower. I had missed family dinners, birthdays, and holidays to manage their database migrations. And now I was being treated like a criminal. I did not cry. Crying would have been a concession, and I do not make concessions. I went back to my desk, packed my personal items into a single cardboard box, and ignored the awkward silence of my coworkers. My assistant, Owen, looked at me with wide, apologetic eyes from across the room. I gave him a small nod. I did 2 things before I left. First, I handed Brenda my badge without saying a word. No anger, no threats, just the quiet click of plastic on the desk. Second, I walked out to my car, opened my personal phone, and accessed my encrypted digital vault. I deleted 1 single file. It was not a password. It was the personal cryptographic certificate tied to my identity as the federal clearance liaison. Without it, the automated handshake between Synapse Systems and Viridian Group could not verify compliance. The merger was now a live grenade, and they had just kicked the pin out of the room. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, watching the glass doors of the building. Employees were walking in and out, completely unaware of the structural failure that had just occurred. They thought they were building a massive corporate empire, but they had just removed the only pillar holding up the roof. My phone was silent, devoid of the constant stream of notifications that had governed my life for over a decade. It was a strange, sudden silence. I turned the key in the ignition and drove out of the parking lot, refusing to look back at the security desk where my face was still taped. I had built those systems to be secure, but I had also built them to be fair. If the company could not respect the person who created the infrastructure, they had no right to benefit from the results. I drove home through the light morning traffic, feeling a sense of absolute clarity. The game had changed, and for the first time in 12 years, I was the one holding all the cards. I parked in my driveway, took a deep breath of the fresh spring air, and carried my cardboard box inside. The transition was complete, and the silence of my home was a welcome contrast to the noise of the office floor. I placed the box on the kitchen table and sat down, listening to the ticking clock. For 12 years, my identity had been defined by that badge, by that desk, by those endless server alerts. Now there was only empty space. It was terrifying, but it was also incredibly liberating. I was no longer a gear in their machine. I was just myself, a woman with a clean slate and a cup of black coffee. I did not even take off my coat when I got home. I just stood in my quiet kitchen, staring at my house keys as if they were foreign objects. The house was silent. There were no urgent messages, no flashing alerts, and no executives asking me to fix their mistakes for free. The box of my office life sat on the dining table. It contained a novelty mug, a notebook filled with network diagrams, and a tin of mints. It felt like a small museum of my own burnout. I walked to the hallway closet, pulled down the fireproof metal box from the top shelf, and opened it. I searched through the tabs until I found the folder marked contingency. I had prepared this folder 2 years ago, not out of paranoia, but because I paid attention. You do not sit in executive meetings for a year and listen to leadership lie about security redundancy without realizing you need an exit strategy. The folder contained the original signed protocols for the Veridian Group integration. My signature was on every page as the certified neutral clearance authority. I turned to the final pages and read Clause 9C. It stated that the termination of the named clearance liaison without a formal federal substitution and a complete recertification process would void the compliance status of the transaction and suspend the legal validity of the acquisition protocol. In plain language, if they fired me without a certified replacement, the $300 million merger became a legal impossibility. They had completely overlooked this clause because none of them actually read the federal filings. They just assumed I would keep the systems running while they took the credit. Well, the system was no longer running. My legal weapon was Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. I had developed the custom integration software on my own time, using my own computers, long before Synapse Systems even proposed the merger. I had registered the copyright under my own name, and my contract included a clear clause stating that I retained all rights under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. I had merely licensed the software to Synapse Systems for the duration of my employment. Now that my employment was terminated, that license was officially revoked. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, I held the exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and display my copyrighted work. Any attempt by Synapse Systems to bypass my cryptographic key or use my software to complete the merger with Veridian Group would constitute willful copyright infringement. My attorney, Nigel Pierce, was already drafting the formal notification. The executives at Synapse Systems thought they had fired a middle-aged compliance officer. They did not realize they had just revoked their own permission to use the very bridge that held their future together. I sat at my desk and reviewed the registration documents. The copyright certificate was signed and stamped by the federal office. It was an absolute shield. They could try to write new code, but rebuilding 12 years of integration logic in 72 hours was technically impossible. They were trapped in a legal box of their own making. I had spent countless nights coding this middleware. I remember sitting at this very kitchen table 3 years ago, with rain lashing against the window, solving the synchronization errors that had baffled the team. I used my own personal laptop, purchased with my own funds, and kept the code in a private repository that was never connected to the company's systems. My employment contract had a very specific, hand-signed amendment that exempted this integration software from the standard intellectual property assignment agreement. I had insisted on it, knowing that my quiet work was too valuable to give away for free. They had signed it without reading, eager to get the bridge running. That was their fatal error. They thought they owned everything in the building, but they did not own my mind or my code. I spent the next 3 hours with Nigel Pierce on the phone, refining the phrasing of our cease and desist letter. Nigel was an old-school lawyer who did not tolerate corporate bullying, and he was delighted by the absolute clarity of our position. He explained that under federal law, the penalties for willful copyright violation were severe, potentially reaching $150,000 per infringement, in addition to statutory damages and legal fees. He assured me that Synapse Systems had absolutely no defense. They had signed the contract containing the carve-out clause, and they had registered the merger protocols with my name attached. By removing me without a transition plan, they had severed their own access to the licensed software. I hung up the phone feeling a profound sense of relief. The law was clear, the documentation was absolute, and the corporate giants were about to learn that they were not above the rules. On Friday morning, the consequences of their arrogance for the merger signing was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the Synapse headquarters. It was supposed to be a grand celebration with expensive suits, press releases, and champagne. But 10 o'clock came and went in complete silence. The representatives from Viridian Group did not arrive. At 10:12, Julian Drake stood at the front of the empty conference room, clicking a pen nervously while trying to maintain his confident smirk. He told the remaining staff that it was just a temporary delay, a minor credentialing issue that they would resolve internally. But the problem was already spreading through the building. My former assistant, Owen, had looked up Clause 9C after I sent him a brief text message. He mentioned it to a colleague who found a copy of the compliance agreement on the shared network drive and sent a screenshot to the legal department. By noon, the office was in a state of panic. The general counsel was shouting at his staff to locate the clearance certificates. Human resources was in chaos, and the finance team had frozen all outgoing transactions. At 10:04 in the evening, my phone rang. It was the chief financial officer of Synapse Systems. I let it go to voicemail. He sounded like a man whose world was actively collapsing. He claimed there was a minor discrepancy with the compliance chain and asked if we could connect briefly to resolve it. I deleted the message. They still did not understand that this was not a minor issue. It was a structural failure. I checked the Federal Registry. My name was still listed as the sole clearance liaison, and the registry showed that the cryptographic handshake had failed due to a key mismatch. The more they panicked, the calmer I felt. It was like watching a fire consume a building after the owners had ignored every safety warning. Owen sent me another message, reporting that the legal team was blaming the technology department, while Julian Drake was claiming it was a simple technical glitch. I did not reply. I made a sandwich, watched the news, and enjoyed the quiet evening. The next day, a courier arrived at my house. He drove a gray sedan and carried a thick manila envelope. He rang the doorbell repeatedly, but I sat quietly inside and watched him on my security camera. He eventually left the envelope in my mailbox and drove away. I did not open it. I knew it contained desperate offers, apologies, and promises of restructuring. They still thought they could resolve this with corporate pressure. They did not understand that the bridge was gone, and I was the only one who knew how to rebuild it. I spent the afternoon working on my garden, enjoying the physical labor and the fresh air. The corporate world felt distant and irrelevant. I had spent 12 years worrying about their servers, their timelines, and their profits. Now my only concern was the layout of my flower beds and the health of my rose bushes. The feel of the soil in my hands was a grounding reminder that life existed outside of databases and town halls. The contrast was incredibly peaceful. Let them scream, let them panic, let them realize the true value of the person they had discarded. They had built a house of cards and acted surprised when the wind blew it over. I smiled to myself as I pruned the dead leaves, feeling a deep, quiet connection to the earth and the natural cycles of growth and decay. As the sun began to set, I walked down the driveway to retrieve the mail. The manila envelope sat at the bottom of the box, looking heavy and desperate. I carried it back to the house, but did not open it immediately. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen counter next to my teapot. I knew exactly what it contained because I had seen it play out before. When executives fail, they try to buy their way out of the disaster. They would offer promotions, money, and titles, but they would never offer actual respect. I sat down with a cup of hot tea and watched the shadows lengthen across the living room. The silence was absolute, a beautiful contrast to the chaotic noise that was undoubtedly filling the executive offices downtown. Let them spend the weekend sweating over their spreadsheets and searching for workarounds that did not exist. By Monday morning, they would realize that the only way forward was to meet my terms. I would not negotiate, I would not compromise, and I would not allow them to treat me like a liability again. I finished my tea, washed the cup, and went to bed early. For the first time in years, I slept soundly, without once checking my phone for server alerts. By Monday morning, the situation was terminal. Viridian Group sent a formal notification suspending the merger indefinitely due to the lack of compliance certification. The news leaked to the financial press, and Synapse Systems saw its valuation drop precipitously. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. The lead investor, Alistair Thorne, demanded to know who had authorized my termination without a transition plan. He pointed out that they had not just fired an employee, they had cut their own lifeline. The leaked photograph of my face taped to the security desk had gone viral on professional networking sites, destroying the company's public image. Former employees were sharing their own stories of corporate mistreatment, and the reputation of the leadership team was in ruins. The post had gathered over 10,000 shares and hundreds of comments from industry professionals condemning the company's behavior. The public relations team had tried to issue a statement claiming it was a security misunderstanding, but the online community saw right through it. The embarrassment was complete, and the board was feeling the pressure from every angle. Julian Drake tried to defend his decisions, but Alistair Thorne silenced him and demanded his immediate resignation. Later that afternoon, Brenda sent a new offer to my lawyer, Nigel Pearce. They offered to double my previous salary, grant me executive authority, and provide a substantial retention bonus if I would return and sign the compliance documents. Nigel Pearce responded with a short letter. He stated that I had no interest in returning as an employee. However, my newly registered entity, Quiet Seal LLC, was willing to license the integration software to Synapse Systems under strict terms. The licensing fee would be 4 times my previous annual salary, paid up front as a non-refundable retainer, and all work would be conducted remotely under my sole direction. They had no choice but to agree. The alternative was the total collapse of the company and lawsuits from their investors. I signed the contract as the owner of Quiet Seal LLC, received the payment, and restored the cryptographic handshake. The merger completed 2 days later, but the leadership team was gone. Julian Drake was dismissed, the chief financial officer resigned in disgrace, and the board was restructured. I sat in my home office, drinking fresh coffee, and looked at the contract on my screen. I had not sought revenge. I had simply enforced the rules they chose to ignore. They thought they could treat people like disposable parts, but they forgot that some parts are foundational. And now, every time they run their systems, they will remember who built the bridge and exactly what it cost to cross it. My business was growing, my schedule was my own, and my value was finally recognized in writing. I shut down my computer, stood up from my desk, and walked to the window. The sun was setting over the trees, casting a warm orange glow across the room. It was a beautiful evening, and the silence was perfect. The next few weeks were a blur of transition work, but this time it was entirely on my own terms. I spent my mornings drinking tea on the back porch, watching the birds, and reviewing system logs only when I felt like it. There were no more emergency phone calls at midnight, no more frantic messages from panicked directors, and no more office politics to navigate. Quiet Seal LLC was already receiving inquiries from other firms that had heard about the Viridian merger. They wanted the same clean, bulletproof compliance integration that I had built for Synapse Systems. I was no longer a hidden employee working in the shadows. I was an independent consultant with a waiting list of clients. I walked over to the bookshelf and picked up the small velvet box that the courier had delivered from Viridian Group. I opened it and read the note inside once more. It was a simple acknowledgement of the truth. I smiled, placed it back on the shelf, and walked out into the warm evening. I had not just survived their corporate restructuring. I had built a new life from the wreckage of their arrogance. The sky was a deep shade of blue, and the stars were beginning to appear. I breathed in the cool night air and felt a deep, lasting sense of peace. I was finally free. no longer bound by the expectations of others, no longer a ghost in someone else's machine. I had built the bridge, I had owned the path, and I had claimed the future. It was a perfect ending to a long journey, and a beautiful beginning to everything that lay ahead. As I watched the night sky darken, I realized that true victory is not about shouting, but about being so essential that your absence says everything that needs to be said.